Ever walked into a place and instantly felt judged? Like the moment they laid eyes on you, they had already decided you didn't belong? Now imagine walking into a luxury car dealership, ready to spend your hard-earned money, only to be dismissed, humiliated, and treated like a waste of time. Sounds infuriating, right? But what if I told you that the man they tried to push out was actually their new boss? This isn't just a story about revenge, it's a story about power, respect, and the shocking moment when arrogance gets crushed by reality. By the end of this video, you'll witness how one man turned humiliation into a life-changing lesson, not just for himself, but for an entire business. And trust me, you won't believe how it all unfolds. Because today, someone learns that real power isn't about what you wear, it's about who you are. Stick around, you won't want to miss this. The late afternoon sun hung low over Crestwood, casting long golden streaks across Redwood Avenue, the city's high-end district where the rich flaunted their status through exotic cars and custom-tailored suits. It was the kind of place where the air smelled of money, fresh leather, aged whiskey, and the faint musk of arrogance. Silvercrest Motors stood like a glass temple in the middle of it all, its pristine showroom gleaming with the latest models of ultra-luxury vehicles. Through the tall windows, men in tailored suits sipped espresso while admiring cars worth more than most people's homes. Salesmen moved smoothly among them, their voices confident, their smiles practiced. Then, through the dealership's entrance, walked a man who didn't fit the usual profile of a Silvercrest customer. Tall, broad-shouldered, and carrying himself with an effortless grace, Malcolm Hayes stepped inside. He was in his early 40s with deep brown skin, neatly trimmed facial hair, and eyes that held a quiet but undeniable intensity. His navy blue button-down shirt was crisp, though simple. His slacks were well-fitted, but nothing about him screamed wealth, not in the way these people were used to recognizing it. Yet Malcolm exuded a confidence that didn't need validation. As he walked past the first row of polished luxury sedans, heads turned. Some looks were subtle, mere flickers of curiosity. Others were more blatant, eyes scanning his appearance, searching for some sign that he belonged here. By the time Malcolm reached the heart of the showroom, a man in his late 50s, with slicked-back silver-streaked hair and a pressed charcoal suit, had already sized him up. Logan Whitmore had been in sales for decades, and he could spot a serious buyer the moment they walked in. To him, Malcolm didn't fit the profile. Still, professionalism dictated he acknowledge the man, though with as little enthusiasm as possible. "Sir," Logan greeted, his tone dripping with artificial politeness. "Can I help you find something?" Malcolm turned to him, offering an easy smile. "I was just admiring the collection." His fingers lightly traced the edge of a Vortex 900, a deep obsidian coupe with sleek aerodynamic curves, the kind of car that purred at a touch and roared when unleashed. Logan followed his gaze and smirked. "Ah, the Vortex. A real beauty, isn't it?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "This one starts at $320, sir. It's not exactly practical." Something in his voice made it clear. This wasn't for you. Malcolm didn't react. He was used to this. Used to being underestimated. Used to the subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways people assumed who he was based on nothing more than appearance. Still, he decided to play along. "Seems like a fine car," he mused, stepping around it, running a hand over the smooth surface. "How does it handle?" Logan's brow twitched. "Ah, well, unfortunately, we don't offer test drives unless—" He hesitated, as if debating whether to continue, but then pressed on, "unless the customer provides proof of financial eligibility first." His voice was friendly, but his eyes carried something else. The kind of look people gave when they thought they were letting you down gently, when in reality, they were telling you that you didn't belong. From behind the counter, a younger salesman, Jake Evans, shifted uncomfortably. He had been working at Silvercrest Motors for 2 years, and he had seen Logan pull this routine before. The older salesman had a habit of measuring customers by their outward appearance. If they didn't fit his idea of wealth, he dismissed them. Jake studied Malcolm, noting the way the man's expression didn't change. He wasn't flustered, he wasn't arguing, he just stood there, cool and unreadable, like he was letting Logan dig his own grave. Logan, oblivious, went on. "We've had incidents before, you see. people coming in, wanting to take pictures, pretending they can afford something they can't. It's nothing personal, of course. Of course, Malcolm exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to shake his head. It was always the same rehearsed dismissals, the same veiled insults, the same arrogance wrapped in fake politeness. Before he could respond, the glass doors slid open with a whisper, and another customer entered. A man in a tailored suit, polished loafers, and a platinum crest watch gleaming on his wrist. Instantly, Logan's attention shifted. "Mr. Calloway!" Logan practically beamed, leaving Malcolm mid-conversation as he hurried to greet the new arrival. "So good to see you again, sir. The Orem series you were interested in just arrived this morning. Right this way." Malcolm watched as Logan all but escorted the man toward the other side of the showroom, the salesman's entire demeanor changing in a heartbeat. The contrast was almost laughable. From behind the counter, Jake's jaw tightened. He wasn't the only one who had noticed. A few customers, an older couple in particular, had also witnessed the exchange. The woman leaned toward her husband and whispered, "That was uncomfortable, wasn't it?" Her husband, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses, nodded slowly. "Very." But Logan, he was completely unaware of the growing tension in the room. Malcolm, however, was not. He glanced at Jake, who quickly looked away, pretending to busy himself with the computer. Then, with a small shake of his head, Malcolm turned back toward the Vortex 900, running his fingers along the sleek contours of the hood. His voice was soft but firm when he finally spoke. "What if I told you," Malcolm said to no one in particular, "that I could buy every single car in this showroom right now?" Logan, having wrapped up his enthusiastic greeting with Mr. Calloway, caught the words mid-stride. He turned back, an amused smirk playing at his lips. "Oh, come on now." Logan let out a chuckle, shaking his head. "You think I haven't seen this before?" He motioned vaguely in Malcolm's direction. "Guys walk in, trying to look important, talking big, hoping to impress someone." His grin widened. "Let me give you some advice, sir. If you want to look serious, start by dressing the part." Silence. Jake swallowed hard. The older couple frowned. Even some of the employees, usually indifferent to Logan's antics, seemed unsettled. But Malcolm? He simply smiled, calm, collected, unbothered. Then, with deliberate ease, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black envelope. It was embossed with the Silver Crest Motors logo, the gold lettering catching the light as he placed it on the counter in front of Jake. "Before you embarrass yourself any further," Malcolm said, his tone even, "you might want to read this." Jake hesitated before taking the envelope, his eyes darting toward Logan, who scoffed. "What is this? A complaint?" Logan snorted, reaching for the envelope himself. "I don't have time for—" His voice cut off as he flipped it open and read the first few lines. And then, just like that, the blood drained from his face. For a long, stretched-out second, silence hung in the air like an uninvited guest. Logan Whitmore stared at the document in his hands, his once smug expression shifting, cracking, unraveling. His jaw tensed, his lips parted slightly, as if struggling to form a response. The golden letters embossed at the top of the page gleamed under the recessed lighting. Silver Crest Motors, Ownership Transfer Agreement. And right below that, in bold, inescapable ink, Malcolm Hayes. Jake, still standing behind the counter, leaned in just enough to glimpse the paper, and his eyes widened. He sucked in a sharp breath. No way. The older couple, still within earshot, exchanged glances. The tension in the showroom thickened, swirling between the polished cars and the marble floors. Every whisper, every shift of movement felt amplified. But Malcolm? Malcolm just stood there, unshaken, waiting, watching. Finally, Logan cleared his throat, though it came out hoarse. He forced a laugh, strained, artificial. This must be a mistake. He straightened, attempting to gather the tattered remains of his composure. "I mean, surely there's been some—" "No mistake," Malcolm interrupted, his voice smooth, firm. Logan hesitated, his fingers tightening around the edges of the document as if squeezing it hard enough might change the words. But nothing changed. Nothing could change the fact that the man he had just dismissed, belittled, practically pushed out of the showroom, was now his boss. A slow, quiet realization dawned on the rest of the dealership staff. The murmurs among employees grew, subtle but undeniable. The same salesmen who had watched Malcolm with mild amusement before were suddenly more attentive. The receptionist at the front, who had barely looked up when he walked in, now sat rigid, her fingers frozen above the keyboard. Even Jake, still processing what was happening, felt the electric charge in the air. And Logan? Logan was drowning in it. His mind scrambled for a foothold, some way to recover, to reset the narrative. A smile twitched at the corners of his mouth, though it never fully formed. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his tone forcibly polite, shifting his stance as if suddenly remembering how to show respect. "If I had known—" Malcolm tilted his head slightly, cutting him off without words. His eyes, dark and unwavering, held Logan in place. "If you had known," Malcolm said evenly, "what would you have done differently?" A simple question, but devastating in its weight, because they both knew the answer. Logan's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. He hesitated, too long. Malcolm didn't need a response. He already had it. He turned his gaze away from Logan, letting him stew in his own silence, and instead focused on Jake, who had been standing quietly behind the counter. "You've been here a while, haven't you?" Malcolm asked. His tone was conversational, but there was an undercurrent of something more. Jake blinked, straightening. Yes, sir. 2 years." Malcolm nodded, as if filing that information away. Then he casually placed his hands in his pockets, glancing around the showroom with an air of quiet contemplation. Logan, still gripping the document, cleared his throat again. "Mr. Hayes, I'd be more than happy to personally walk you through our inventory," he offered, his voice suddenly light, eager. "We have an exclusive line of—" "That won't be necessary." Malcolm's response was calm, but it cut through Logan's words like a blade. Logan flinched but forced another smile. "Of course, I understand. I just want to make sure you have the best experience possible." Malcolm let out a small, dry chuckle. "Is that right?" His gaze flicked back to Logan, studying him. "Because from what I just experienced, it seems like the best experience possible is only reserved for certain kinds of customers." Logan's face turned a shade paler. Malcolm took a step closer, closing the gap between them. Not in an aggressive way, but in a way that made it impossible for Logan to ignore the weight of the moment. "I want you to think very carefully about how many people you've treated like that before," Malcolm said, his voice lower now, quieter, but carrying far more force. "How many walked through those doors and left feeling humiliated because you decided, without knowing a single thing about them, that they weren't worth your time?" Logan's lips pressed into a thin line. He said nothing, because again, they both knew the answer. Behind them, the showroom was painfully still. Every set of eyes had settled on the two men, but no one dared to interrupt. Even customers, who would normally be lost in discussions about horsepower and custom interiors, were now nothing more than silent witnesses to a reckoning. Jake, standing just a few feet away, swallowed against the tightness in his throat. He wasn't sure if he should say something, if he even had the right to, but something about watching Logan, usually so smug and untouchable, shift uncomfortably under Malcolm's unrelenting gaze. It made him feel like justice, for once, was being served right where it was needed. Logan finally inhaled, his breath shaky. He straightened his posture, squared his shoulders. "Mr. Hayes, I truly didn't mean to offend." "Stop," Malcolm said, holding up a hand. "Just stop." Logan froze. Malcolm exhaled, shaking his head. "You meant exactly what you did," he said. "You just didn't expect to get called out for it." Logan opened his mouth, then closed it again, because there was nothing left to say. Malcolm let the silence settle between them, letting Logan sit with the weight of his own actions. Then, with deliberate ease, he turned back toward Jake. "You said you've been here for 2 years?" Jake, caught off guard, nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." Malcolm studied him for a moment, then glanced toward the other employees who had been observing from a distance. Some avoided eye contact. Others looked intrigued, maybe even hopeful. Then, without another word, Malcolm started toward the back of the showroom, his footsteps measured, unhurried. As he moved, the once aloof employees subtly adjusted their postures, their expressions shifting from passive disinterest to careful attention. The power dynamic had changed, and everyone in the room knew it. Logan remained frozen in place, gripping the ownership document as though it might slip from his fingers. He wasn't used to feeling powerless. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of judgment. But today he had been seen for exactly who he was, and he had no idea what was coming next. The weight of the moment hung thick in the air, pressing down on every inch of Silvercrest Motors. Employees stood frozen, customers whispered, and even the gentle hum of the dealership's central air system seemed to have quieted, as if the entire room were holding its breath. And in the center of it all, Logan Whitmore gripped the ownership document like it was a piece of his own shattered dignity. His hands twitched slightly, a cold sweat forming at his temples. His gaze darted around the room, desperately searching for some kind of anchor, some way to undo what had just unfolded before everyone's eyes. He found none. Malcolm Hayes, the man he had just dismissed, ridiculed, and humiliated, now stood with a calm authority that didn't need to be announced. It radiated from him. But Logan wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. With a strained chuckle, he forced himself to move, to try and salvage his crumbling position. Now, he said, his voice unnaturally loud, attempting to reclaim control of the conversation. There's been a misunderstanding here. Malcolm raised an eyebrow. A misunderstanding? Logan nodded quickly, laughing again, this time even more awkwardly. I mean, come on, Mr. Hayes. You know how these things go. We have procedures. We deal with all sorts of people walking in here, saying all sorts of things. I was just following protocol. His voice carried through the showroom, and the way he emphasized we deal with all sorts of people wasn't lost on anyone. Malcolm exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening slightly. He had heard excuses like this before. People never just admitted their wrongdoing. They danced around it, disguised it, tried to make it seem like their actions were justified, like he was the one who had been in the wrong for expecting to be treated with basic respect. Jake, still standing behind the counter, shifted uncomfortably. He could feel the second-hand embarrassment radiating from Logan's pathetic attempt at damage control. I see, Malcolm said, his voice slow, measured. So when you told me, loud enough for half the showroom to hear, that I needed to prove I could afford a car before you'd even answer a simple question, that was just following protocol? Logan's smile faltered. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Well, I mean... And when you left me standing there, Malcolm continued, his voice carrying now, cutting through the forced silence of the room, to rush over to someone else without a second thought because he looked like he belonged here. That was protocol, too. The older couple near the display models exchanged glances. A few other customers subtly nodded. They had all seen it. There was no arguing with what had just happened. Logan's face turned a deeper shade of red. He was losing ground fast. Mr. Hayes, You know what's funny? Malcolm interrupted, taking a slow step closer. He wasn't raising his voice, but somehow every word hit harder than if he had been shouting. I walked in here today, genuinely interested in seeing what this place had to offer. I didn't ask for special treatment. I didn't even ask for a discount. All I asked was a simple question about a car, and what I got in return. He let out a small, humorless chuckle. Was this? Logan's mouth opened, then closed. A heavy silence followed. Then, somewhere toward the back of the showroom, an employee coughed. The sound seemed to shake something loose in the atmosphere. Logan, still desperate to regain some semblance of control, straightened his spine, forced his best corporate damage control smile, and attempted one last move. Mr. Hayes, he said, adopting a tone of exaggerated friendliness, if I came across as dismissive, I sincerely apologize. It was never my intention to make you feel unwelcome. Malcolm tilted his head slightly. Unwelcome, he repeated, his voice soft but edged with something sharp. Logan nodded quickly. Absolutely. Silvercrest Motors prides itself on inclusivity, and if there was a lapse in service, I take full responsibility. There it was, the corporate apology, the carefully curated words meant to diffuse tension without actually acknowledging the real issue. Malcolm sighed, rubbing his thumb against his palm. You ever get tired, Logan? He asked suddenly. Logan blinked, thrown off by the question. Excuse me? Tired, Malcolm repeated, of playing this game, of pretending you don't know exactly what you did, of acting like it was just a lapse in service when we both know damn well it was something else entirely. A hushed gasp came from somewhere in the room. Logan's eyes darted left and right, his discomfort now palpable. He wasn't just being called out anymore, he was being seen, stripped down to the ugly truth of his actions. For a moment, the older salesman simply stood there, trapped in the center of a reality he had spent years ignoring. But Malcolm, Malcolm was done letting him off the hook. He turned his head slightly, scanning the room. "How many of you," he called out, addressing not just Logan but everyone in the showroom, "have walked into a place like this and been made to feel like you didn't belong?" The question hung in the air like a slow-burning fire. At first, no one moved. Then, subtly, a few heads nodded. The older woman near the display cars clasped her hands together, her expression a mix of sympathy and quiet understanding. A younger man near the window, dressed in casual clothes, exhaled sharply and looked away. Even one of the security guards, an older black man, shifted his stance, a flicker of something unreadable passing through his eyes. They all knew. They had all felt it. And now, in the middle of this gleaming showroom filled with million-dollar vehicles and hollow smiles, someone was finally saying it out loud. Logan, chest rising and falling with uneven breaths, looked like a man teetering on the edge of panic. Malcolm simply held his gaze. He had nothing left to prove. Not to Logan. Not to anyone in this room. He had already won. The weight of Malcolm's words hadn't just landed on Logan. They had seeped into the very walls of Silvercrest Motors, lingering in the polished floors, in the cold glass display cases, in the sharp scent of expensive leather and waxed metal. And in that moment, the silence wasn't just awkward, it was revealing. Because silence had a way of exposing people. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the hesitation in someone's breath, the quick dart of an eye, the stiffness of a posture. It was the unspoken agreement between those who had seen but never interfered. And right now, every single person in that showroom was asking themselves the same question: where do I stand in this? Jake Evans stood behind the counter, fingers gripping the edge as if it were the only thing grounding him. He had worked here for 2 years. 2 years watching Logan pick and choose who got treated with warmth and who got brushed aside. 2 years knowing it was wrong but never saying anything because, well, what could he do? He was just a junior salesman. And yet, looking at Malcolm now, standing firm while Logan squirmed under the weight of his own actions, Jake felt something shift inside him. Not just guilt, regret. Because the truth was, he had seen this before, too many times, and not just from Logan. A few feet away, the receptionist, a young woman with sleek blonde hair and sharp blue eyes, swallowed hard. She had barely looked at Malcolm when he entered, barely acknowledged his presence. But now she couldn't stop staring. One of the senior salesmen, a burly man in his late 40s named Brent, rubbed his jaw, looking anywhere but at Malcolm. He had been at Silvercrest for over a decade and had once called Logan his closest friend. But now, even he had taken a slow step back, distancing himself from the sinking ship. And the customers? Some looked uncomfortable, shifting on their feet. Others watched with interest, as if witnessing something they'd tell their friends about later over cocktails. But a few had their arms crossed, nodding, because they knew what this was. They'd seen it in different forms, different places, but always the same shape. Disrespect dressed as professionalism. Prejudice disguised as policy. Logan, still standing in the center of it all, was unraveling. His eyes darted around the room, looking for allies, for someone, anyone to step in, to change the subject, to save him. No one did. So he did what people like him always did when caught. He tried to shift the blame. "Look," Logan started, his voice strained but attempting to sound reasonable. I didn't mean to offend anyone. That's not who I am. I was just following procedure. A weak excuse. A desperate one." But Malcolm just let out a slow, deliberate breath and studied him. "You keep saying that," Malcolm murmured. "That you were following procedure." He let the words settle for a second before adding, "Tell me something, Logan. If I had walked in here wearing a tailored suit, a Rolex, and Italian loafers, would you have made me follow procedure?" Logan opened his mouth, shut it, opened it again. Malcolm didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his posture relaxed but commanding, his deep brown eyes never leaving Logan's. "I've been watching you this whole time," Malcolm said, voice low but strong enough to carry through the stillness. "The way you dismissed me, the way you cut me off mid-sentence, the way you greeted that other customer like royalty while treating me like an inconvenience." He tilted his head. "Tell me, Logan, what exactly did you see when you looked at me?" Logan took an unsteady breath. "You saw a man who didn't belong," Malcolm answered for him. "A man who, in your mind, wasn't worth the effort. He let the words sink in before continuing. "And you know what the worst part is?" Logan swallowed. Malcolm's gaze darkened, just slightly. "I wasn't even surprised." A flicker of something passed through Logan's eyes. Anger. It was hard to tell. But before he could respond, someone else did. A voice, soft but clear, broke the silence. "I saw it, too." Logan turned sharply, as did Malcolm. It was the older woman near the Orem series display, the one who had been whispering to her husband earlier. She was in her late 60s, dressed elegantly but not extravagantly, her pearl necklace resting just below the collar of her lavender blouse. "I saw the way you spoke to him," she continued, her voice even but firm. "And I saw the way you spoke to the other man. There was a difference, a very clear one." Her husband, standing beside her, nodded. "You don't have to be a genius to see it," he added. A murmur rippled through the room. Other customers shifted, some nodding, some exchanging glances. A few employees, including Jake, let out slow, exhaled breaths as if something they had been holding inside for too long had finally been spoken aloud. Logan's face was burning now. His pride was being dismantled in front of his colleagues, his clients, his employees. And worst of all, he couldn't argue, because they were right. All of them. Malcolm, however, wasn't looking for an audience. He had already seen what he needed to see. He turned to Jake, who was still standing there, looking almost unsure of what to do. "You said you've been here for 2 years, right?" Jake blinked. Yes, sir." Malcolm nodded slowly, like he was making a decision right then and there. Then, with a glance back at Logan, who now looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole, Malcolm spoke again. "Good." He adjusted the cuffs of his sleeves, casting one last look around the room before turning on his heel and walking toward the executive offices in the back. As he passed Logan, he didn't even glance his way. And that was worse than any argument. The sound of Malcolm's footsteps echoed through the vast showroom as he moved toward the executive offices at the back. The polished marble floors reflected the overhead lights, giving the illusion that he was walking on liquid gold. But he wasn't in a hurry. No. This was a moment that deserved to be drawn out. Behind him, the room remained in a stunned silence. Logan stood frozen, gripping the ownership document so tightly that the edges crumpled beneath his fingers. His face was a mask of disbelief, pride fighting against the raw realization of what had just happened. This was the moment of truth. Jake, still at the counter, inhaled sharply, his pulse pounding in his ears. He had worked in this dealership long enough to recognize a power shift when he saw one. And this wasn't just a shift, this was a reckoning. As Malcolm reached the executive suite, he didn't knock. He didn't need to. He pushed the glass door open, and inside sat Richard Faulkner, the previous owner of Silvercrest Motors. Richard was a man in his late 60s, with thinning white hair and a body that had once been athletic but now sagged from years of comfort. He was seated behind a massive mahogany desk, fingers steepled, his face unreadable. But Malcolm saw it. The flicker of recognition, the calculation. Because unlike Logan, Richard knew exactly who Malcolm Hayes was. "You're early," Richard said, leaning back in his chair, his expression neutral. "I figured you'd wait until after closing hours to make your first appearance." Malcolm let out a short breath, half a chuckle, half something else. "And miss all the fun?" Richard smirked slightly. "I take it Logan greeted you, accordingly." Malcolm tilted his head, eyes narrowing just slightly. "You knew he'd do that, didn't you?" Richard exhaled, shifting in his chair. He didn't confirm, he didn't deny, which was confirmation enough. Malcolm let the silence stretch for a moment, then took a seat across from the older man, resting his elbows on the desk, his fingers loosely clasped together. "I've seen a lot of people like Logan in my life," Malcolm said, his voice even. "Men who think power comes from a suit, from a title, from their ability to make someone feel small." He let the words settle before adding, "Men who think they own respect instead of earning it." Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. Malcolm studied him for a beat, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, tapping the screen a few times before placing it face up on the desk. The screen showed a paused video feed, security footage from the showroom floor. Richard's eyes flicked to it, his jaw tightening slightly. "You have cameras all over this place," Malcolm said, his voice casual. "I figured, before I walked in here, that it wouldn't be a bad idea to get access to them." He glanced at the screen. This one has audio. Richard let out a slow exhale, finally reaching for the phone. He pressed play, and there it was, Logan's voice, clear, undeniable, the condescension in his tone, the arrogance, the dismissiveness, every smug remark, every veiled insult. And then Malcolm's response, calm, measured. And finally, the moment Logan's face had dropped when he read the ownership document. Richard listened in silence, his fingers lightly tapping against the desk. When the video ended, he let out a low hum and set the phone back down. "Well," he said, rubbing his chin. "That's unfortunate." Malcolm's lips twitched. "Unfortunate?" Richard exhaled, his eyes drifting toward the large window behind him, overlooking the showroom floor. Logan was still standing there, gripping the paper like it was the last thing tethering him to his old life. "I suppose you're expecting me to fire him," Richard mused. Malcolm tilted his head slightly. "I don't need you to do anything." Richard met his gaze again. "You already made up your mind, then?" Malcolm didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, studying the older man. Richard Faulkner was a businessman, through and through. He didn't run this place out of passion. He ran it because it was lucrative, because people with too much money and too little sense would always want to show off their wealth. But Malcolm built his success from the ground up. He knew what it was like to walk into a room and be underestimated, to be judged before speaking a single word. He had lived it, fought against it, and now he owned the very place that had tried to push him out, and that meant things were about to change. Malcolm let out a slow breath, then finally stood up, sliding his phone back into his pocket. "I'll handle it." Richard watched him carefully, then nodded. "I had a feeling you'd say that." Malcolm turned, his fingers brushing against the wood of the desk before he started toward the door. Just before he stepped out, Richard spoke again. "You know, Malcolm," he said, his voice lower now, "you and I are different in a lot of ways, but there's one thing we have in common." Malcolm paused, glancing back. "We both know that power isn't given," Richard said, his gaze steady. "It's taken." Malcolm held his stare for a long second. Then, without another word, he walked out. As the door closed behind him, the quiet hum of the dealership returned, but it was different now. Because Silvercrest Motors was no longer just a luxury dealership. It was now Malcolm Hayes' empire. And Logan Whitmore, his time was running out. Malcolm stepped out of the executive office, his presence alone shifting the energy in the room. The air inside Silvercrest Motors felt heavier now, thick with the weight of unspoken words and the realization that the game had changed. Logan Whitmore was still standing near the counter, his knuckles white against the ownership document he clung to like a lifeline. His once confident posture had deflated, his usual smugness replaced by something unfamiliar, something dangerously close to fear. The other employees had distanced themselves from him, as if the taint of his arrogance was contagious. They weren't sure where they stood now, but they knew one thing for certain. Logan was no longer the most powerful man in the room, and he knew it too. Malcolm took his time walking back toward the center of the showroom, his footsteps steady, deliberate. Every eye in the room followed him. Customers, employees, even the security guard near the entrance. They were all waiting to see what would happen next. Jake, still behind the counter, straightened instinctively when Malcolm approached. He was young, sharp, and unlike Logan, he had never let ego get in the way of his instincts. And right now, his instincts told him that something monumental was about to happen. Malcolm stopped just a few feet from Logan, his gaze unreadable. "Tell me, Logan," he said, his voice calm but carrying weight. "How long have you been working here?" Logan blinked, thrown off by the question. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. 10 years. Malcolm nodded, considering that. 10 years. He let the words hang in the air. "And in all that time, I'm guessing you've closed a lot of deals, made this place a lot of money." Logan straightened slightly, sensing an opening. Yes, I have. I'm one of the top salesmen in this company." Malcolm studied him for a moment. "And how many customers do you think you lost?" Logan's expression froze. "Excuse me?" "How many people walked through those doors?" Malcolm continued, tilting his head, looked around, asked a few questions, and left because you made them feel like they weren't worth your time. A hush fell over the room. Logan's face reddened, and for the first time in years he was at a loss for words. Because here's the thing, Logan, Malcolm went on, stepping closer. A business like this, it's not just about sales, it's about reputation. And a reputation can be built over decades, but it only takes one moment, one decision to tear it all down. Logan shifted uncomfortably. Malcolm held up a hand, cutting him off. Do you remember what you said to me when I first walked in? Logan's mouth opened, then closed. Malcolm chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Let me remind you, he said. He glanced at Jake. Do you remember? Jake hesitated, glancing at Logan before nodding slowly. You asked Mr. Hayes if he was lost. A quiet murmur passed through the room. Malcolm nodded, his expression hardening. You looked at me and assumed, without hesitation, that I didn't belong here, that I was wasting your time. You tried to embarrass me in front of your colleagues, your customers, because you thought you had the power to do it. He paused. But you never had the power, Logan. You just had the illusion of it. Logan's breathing was unsteady now, his pride unraveling thread by thread. Malcolm took a step back and turned toward Jake. How long have you been here? Jake swallowed, his eyes flickering between Malcolm and Logan. 2 years. 2 years, Malcolm repeated, nodding slightly. He looked around the room, making sure everyone was listening. In 2 years, I've seen more integrity from you than I have from Logan in 10. Jake's eyes widened. Logan's face darkened. Mr. Hayes, Malcolm ignored him. I've been watching you, Jake. You don't talk down to customers. You don't assume. You listen. He turned back toward Logan, locking eyes with him. That's what leadership looks like. Logan's expression twisted, his last thread of composure slipping. Wait a second. You're not seriously. You're fired. The words hit the air like a gunshot. The room went still. Jake's mouth dropped open slightly. The receptionist gasped softly. Brent, who had been trying to blend into the background, scratched his jaw but said nothing. Logan took a sharp step forward, his face a mix of panic and disbelief. Mr. Hayes, you can't be serious. I've given 10 years to this place. Malcolm's gaze didn't waver. And in 10 years, how many people did you humiliate the way you tried to humiliate me today? Logan's breath hitched. Malcolm took a slow, deliberate step forward. I don't run my businesses on arrogance, Logan. I don't run them on discrimination, on elitism, or on outdated mentalities that push away good people. This dealership, he gestured to the space around them. It's mine now, and I refuse to let it be a place where anyone is made to feel small. Logan's lips trembled. You can clean out your desk, Malcolm said, his voice final. Security will escort you out. For the first time in his life, Logan Whitmore had nothing to say. The silence in the room stretched. Jake, still in shock, barely noticed when Malcolm turned back toward him. Congratulations, Malcolm said, offering a small, knowing smile. You're now the new head of sales, Jake blinked. What? You heard me, Malcolm said simply. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. I don't know what to say. Say nothing, Malcolm told him. Just make sure that from now on, every person who walks through those doors is treated with the same level of respect, no matter what they look like. Jake swallowed hard, nodding, and just like that, the power had shifted. Malcolm turned one last time to Logan, who stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and anger. Good luck, Logan, Malcolm said, his tone unreadable. You're going to need it. And with that, he walked away. Logan Whitmore stood frozen, his world unraveling in real time. His breathing was uneven, his pulse pounding in his ears, drowning out the low murmurs of employees and customers who had just witnessed his downfall. Fired. Just like that. For years, he had ruled Silvercrest Motors with an iron grip, dictating who deserved attention and who didn't, deciding which customers were worth his time and which weren't. He had built his career on arrogance, on assumptions, on the unspoken hierarchy that had always worked in his favor. And in less than an hour, it had all crumbled. Malcolm Hayes had stripped him of everything, his position, his authority, his carefully curated illusion of power. But the worst part? He had done it without raising his voice, without anger, without breaking a sweat. That was what stung the most. Logan turned slowly, his eyes darting toward the other employees, looking for something. Sympathy, outrage, anything. But all he saw were faces carefully void of expression. No one stepped forward to defend him. No one argued. Even Brent, his longtime ally, kept his gaze down, as if suddenly fascinated by the grain of the showroom floor. Jake, the junior salesman who had once looked up to him, was still standing behind the counter, his features tight with disbelief. But there was something else there, too. A quiet acceptance. He knew, just like everyone else in the room, that Malcolm had made the right call. Logan felt something sour rise in his throat. He turned to Malcolm, desperation clawing at his voice. "Mr. Hayes," he started, forcing his tone into something that resembled diplomacy. "Let's be reasonable. I've been here a decade. I know this business. I know these customers. You need people like me." Malcolm let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "No," he said, his voice steady. "I need people who know how to treat others with respect." Logan's lips parted slightly like he wanted to argue, but Malcolm had already turned away from him. It was over. The security guard, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s named Terry, finally stepped forward. He had been watching from the sidelines, his expression unreadable, but now he placed a firm hand on Logan's shoulder. "Let's go," Terry said, his tone polite but firm. Logan flinched under the touch, his pride bristling. "I can walk myself out," he snapped, jerking his shoulder free. Terry didn't argue. He simply nodded and took a step back. Logan exhaled sharply, then turned, marching toward his office to gather his things. His shoes clicked against the polished floor, each step echoing through the vast showroom. No one followed him. No one tried to stop what was happening. And that silence, that was the final nail in the coffin. As Logan disappeared into his office, Malcolm took a deep breath, then turned back to Jake. "Come with me," he said. Jake blinked, startled. "Me?" Malcolm nodded. "You're head of sales now. Time to act like it." Jake swallowed, then quickly rounded the counter to follow. The two men walked through the showroom together, the weight of the moment still lingering in the air. Employees whispered as they passed, customers stealing glances. They reached the executive office, formerly Richard Faulkner's, but now Malcolm's. Malcolm pushed the door open and stepped inside. The office was a monument to excess, dark mahogany walls, floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline, and a bar cart stocked with whiskey that had probably been aged longer than some of the employees had been alive. Malcolm didn't sit. Instead, he turned and faced Jake. "You've been here 2 years," he said. "What's the first thing you'd change?" Jake hesitated. "Sir?" Malcolm folded his arms. "You heard me. If you were running this place, what's the first thing you'd fix?" Jake opened his mouth, then shut it. He glanced toward the window, exhaled, then finally said, "The sales floor." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "What about it?" Jake squared his shoulders. "The way customers are treated depends on who's working that day. Some people get the 5-star experience, others get ignored. Some get questioned before they're even allowed to ask about a car." He hesitated, then admitted, "I've seen it happen a lot, and I never said anything." Malcolm nodded slowly. "And now," Jake met his gaze, "now I want to be part of the change." A small smile ghosted across Malcolm's lips. "Good," he said simply, "because that's exactly what we're going to do." Jake exhaled, nodding. "Where do we start?" Malcolm turned toward the window, gazing out at the city below. The skyline of Crestwood stretched far and wide, glittering under the fading afternoon sun. Then, without looking back, he said, "We start by making sure no one ever walks into this dealership and feels like they don't belong." Logan Whitmore sat at his desk, staring blankly at the darkened screen of his computer. His office, once a symbol of his authority, now felt small, suffocating. The blinds were half drawn, allowing only slivers of light to spill through, casting sharp, jagged shadows across the mahogany desk. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him, heavier than anything he had ever carried. He had been fired. Not just let go, not just given a warning or a quiet demotion. Fired, in front of everyone. In the very showroom he had ruled over for years. And the worst part, no one had stood up for him. Not Brent, not the receptionist, not even the younger salesman who used to hang on his every word, eager to absorb his cutthroat tactics. He was alone. Logan clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening into fists. This isn't fair. He had built this place. He had trained half the employees in that showroom. He had closed more high-value deals than anyone else at Silvercrest Motors. And now, because of one stupid moment, because of one man who had walked in looking like he didn't belong, everything was gone. A sharp knock at the door snapped him out of his spiraling thoughts. He didn't answer right away. Then, without waiting for permission, Terry, the security guard, pushed the door open and stepped inside. Terry was a man of few words. He had worked at Silvercrest for longer than Logan, had seen more turnover than anyone, and yet he had never gotten involved in the politics of the sales floor. He kept his head down, did his job, and went home. But right now, his presence felt different. Logan scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "What, Terry, you here to drag me out?" Terry crossed his arms, shaking his head. "No need," he said simply. "You already know what you gotta do." Logan let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Right, pack up my things, take my walk of shame, and disappear." He gestured vaguely around the office. "Say goodbye to all of this." Terry didn't move. "You did this to yourself." Logan's jaw twitched. But he couldn't finish, because deep down he knew Terry was right. Logan exhaled sharply and looked away. His eyes landed on the framed awards on the wall, top salesman of the year plaques, glossy certificates, photos of him shaking hands with high-profile clients. Proof that, at one point, he had been at the top. And now, none of it mattered. Terry shifted slightly, glancing toward the window where the showroom stretched beyond the glass. "You know," he said, his voice steady, "I've seen guys like you come and go, the ones who think they're untouchable, who think their title means more than their character." He paused. "They always fall the hardest." Logan swallowed but said nothing, because Terry wasn't wrong. After a long silence, the security guard stepped aside, nodding toward the door. "Time to go." Logan hesitated. For the first time in his life, he didn't know where to go next, but he knew he couldn't stay here. With a slow, measured breath, he reached for the box beside his desk. He had used it to fire plenty of people over the years. Now it was his turn. He started packing, the awards, the pens, the little trinkets he had collected over the years. Everything felt meaningless now, like relics of a past life. His fingers hovered over a framed photo, him and Richard Faulkner shaking hands on the showroom floor. The former owner had once told him, "You've got potential, Logan, but potential means nothing if you don't know how to lead." Logan had brushed it off at the time. He had thought leadership was about power, about control. But now he wasn't so sure. With one last glance around the office, he tucked the photo into the box, stood up and squared his shoulders. Then, without another word, he walked out. The heavy glass doors of Silvercrest Motors slid open with a soft whisper as Logan Whitmore stepped out, a cardboard box clutched tightly in his arms. The late afternoon sun was blinding, stabbing at his eyes as he blinked rapidly, adjusting to the outside world. The heat pressed against his skin, but it wasn't the sun that made his face burn. It was the weight of humiliation, the knowing stares from employees and customers alike as he had made his way through the showroom. No one had spoken, no farewell, no sympathetic pats on the back, just silence. And somehow, that was worse than any parting words could have been. He had walked the same polished floors he had once ruled, past the same employees who had once feared and respected him. Except now, they wouldn't even meet his gaze. He had been erased before he had even left the building. But the real sting? It wasn't just his job he had lost. It was the image he had spent a decade constructing, the reputation, the status, the power, all gone. He reached his car, a sleek black Lexus LC500, and placed the box in the passenger seat with more force than necessary. The sound echoed in the quiet parking lot. He let out a slow, unsteady breath, gripping the edge of the door for support. And then, from behind him, a voice broke through. "Whitmore." He stiffened, closing his eyes for a brief moment before turning around. Standing just a few feet away, arms crossed over his chest, was Brent, the senior salesman he had once considered an ally. A friend. For a second, Logan felt something like relief. Someone had finally come to say something, to acknowledge him, to remind him that he hadn't just been cast out like a piece of old furniture. But then he caught the look on Brent's face. It wasn't sympathy. It wasn't anger. It was disappointment. Logan forced a smirk, trying to regain at least a shred of his old bravado. "Come to say goodbye?" Brent let out a low breath through his nose, shaking his head. "I've seen you pull that routine 100 times, Logan," he said, his voice level. "The act, the ego, the way you size people up before they even open their mouths." Logan's smirk faltered. "You never had a problem with it before." Brent gave a slow nod, his gaze unreadable. "You're right. I didn't, and that's on me." Logan narrowed his eyes. "What's that supposed to mean?" Brent exhaled, glancing back at the dealership for a brief moment before returning his focus to Logan. It means I let you get away with a lot. We all did. We stood by, let you do things your way, let you make the rules. And you know why? Logan didn't answer. Brent tilted his head slightly. Because we thought you were untouchable. Logan scoffed, shaking his head. Yeah, well, turns out we were wrong. Brent studied him for a beat, then said, No, turns out you were wrong. Logan stilled. Brent took a slow step forward, his voice quieter now, but somehow heavier. You thought the power was in the money, in the cars, in the sales numbers. He let that sit for a second before continuing. But it was never about that. It was about how you treated people. Logan's jaw tightened. I closed deals, didn't I? I made this place millions. Brent nodded. Yeah, you did. His eyes darkened slightly. And how many customers walked away without buying because they felt disrespected? How many people left this place feeling like they weren't good enough, just because you decided they weren't? Logan swallowed hard, but the words sat heavy in his chest. Brent shook his head, glancing toward the showroom again. Through the glass, he could see Malcolm Hayes standing near the counter, speaking to Jake, the new head of sales. They were talking, planning. The next chapter of Silvercrest Motors was already beginning. And Logan? He was nothing more than a footnote in the past. Brent turned back to him. You could have been part of this, Logan, he said. Could have been standing right there with them. But you made your choice. Logan let out a dry laugh, though it held no real humor. Right, and now I get to pay for it. Brent held his gaze. We all pay for our choices. Logan clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He wanted to argue, wanted to push back. Wanted to tell Brent that he had been loyal, that he had earned his place, that Malcolm had just walked in and ripped everything away from him. But deep down in the raw, unspoken part of himself, he knew none of that was true. He had done this to himself. Brent sighed, taking a step back. I hope you figure it out, he said. Whatever's next for you. And with that, he turned and walked back toward the dealership, leaving Logan standing there alone in the blazing heat, the sun making the edges of his vision blur. He had never felt so small, never felt so replaceable. With a sharp inhale, Logan turned, yanked open the car door, and slid inside. The leather seats burned against his skin, but he barely felt it. His fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. For the first time in a long time, Logan Whitmore had no plan, no strategy, no exit route, just a long stretch of road ahead and a past he couldn't outrun. The showroom felt different now. The tension that had thickened the air earlier had dissipated, replaced by something more electrifying. Change. The kind that wasn't just talked about, but felt in the bones of the building, in the cautious but hopeful glances exchanged between employees, in the new weight of responsibility resting on Jake Evans's shoulders. From his spot near the counter, Jake could still see Logan's Lexus pull out of the parking lot, the black car shrinking into the distance, carrying with it the remnants of an era built on arrogance and exclusion, an era that had just ended. He turned back to where Malcolm Hayes stood, hands in his pockets, surveying the showroom like a man who wasn't just stepping into ownership, but into legacy. Jake cleared his throat, still not entirely used to the idea that he had just been promoted to head of sales. Sir, he started, hesitating. Are we really doing this? Malcolm arched a brow. Doing what? Jake gestured vaguely to the room. Changing everything. Malcolm let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. Not everything, he said. Just the things that should have changed a long time ago. Jake swallowed, his throat tight with the weight of what that meant. He had always known Silvercrest Motors was exclusive, but not in the way they advertised. It wasn't just about the cars, it was about who was allowed to feel like they deserved to own them. And Logan? Logan had made sure plenty of people never felt like they did. Malcolm turned, his gaze sharp. What do you think, Jake? Jake hesitated. I think this place has had a reputation for a long time, and not all of it is good. Malcolm nodded. Exactly, that changes today. Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Where do we start? Malcolm looked around, taking in the layout, the staff, the flow of business. Then, with quiet confidence, he said, with the customers. Jake frowned slightly. How do you mean? Malcolm turned to face the showroom entrance. I want you to do something for me. Jake straightened. Anything. Malcolm smirked. "I want you to stand at that door and watch every single person who walks in here. And when they do?" Jake nodded, waiting. Malcolm's voice was steady, unwavering. "Treat them like they belong." Jake blinked. It was such a simple directive, and yet it was everything this dealership had been lacking. Because respect shouldn't be a privilege, it should be the standard. And under Malcolm's ownership, it would be. Jake swallowed, nodding. "Got it." Malcolm patted his shoulder, then turned toward the rest of the employees, all of whom had been listening in silence, waiting. Some still looked uncertain, unsure of what all of this meant for them. Others, though, looked relieved. He took a step forward, standing in the center of the showroom. "Listen up," he said, his voice carrying through the space, smooth and unshaken. "I know today has been eventful. I know some of you are probably wondering what happens next." The employees exchanged glances. Malcolm exhaled. "Here's what happens next. We rebuild. We reshape this place into something better. We hold ourselves to a higher standard, not just for the customers who walk in wearing Rolexes, but for everyone who walks in at all." A murmur rippled through the staff. Malcolm continued. "If you're the kind of person who can stand behind that, who believes in treating people right, no matter what they look like, no matter what assumptions you might have about them, then you're exactly who I want on this team." A few nods, a few subtle shifts in posture. "But," Malcolm added, his voice cooling slightly, "if you think things should stay the way they were, if you think customers should have to prove they belong here before they even open their mouths, then I promise you, this is no longer the place for you." The silence that followed was heavy, but not oppressive. It was clarifying. No one spoke, but no one walked out either. Malcolm took that as a start. He exhaled and clapped his hands once. "All right, let's sell some cars." The tension in the room cracked, giving way to movement, quiet energy, a reset of sorts. Employees adjusted their ties, checked their tablets, and returned to their work. Except now, something was different. It wasn't just about selling luxury anymore. It was about something bigger. Jake lingered for a second longer, watching Malcolm, his mind still spinning from everything that had happened. Then, with a quiet nod to himself, he walked to the entrance like Malcolm had told him, standing at the door, waiting for the next customer to step through. And this time, whoever they were, whoever they looked like, they would be welcomed. And just like that, the tables turned. What started as a moment of humiliation ended as a powerful lesson, not just for Logan, but for everyone watching. Because in the end, respect isn't something you hand out based on appearances. It's something that should be given to everyone, no exceptions. Now, think about your own life. Have you ever been underestimated? Judged before you even had a chance to prove yourself? Or maybe, be honest, have you ever judged someone too quickly and later realized you were wrong? This story isn't just about a car dealership. It's about how we see people, how we treat people, and how the smallest assumptions can change everything. So tell me, what would you have done in Malcolm's place? Would you have handled it the same way, or would you have done something different? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. And if you love stories like this, stories that make you think, that challenge the way we see the world, then hit that subscribe button and turn on the notifications. That way, you'll never miss a new video. Because trust me, there's always another story to tell. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.